So let me ask you something. What do you do with a man who beat Ronnie Sox 5 times in a row, who averaged $800 a match race appearance at a time when that was serious money, who the NHRA themselves named one of the 50 greatest drag racers who ever lived? What do you do with that man? Apparently, you forget him. And that's what happened to Malcolm Durham. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Because it wasn't one thing. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't one bad decision. It was 3 separate forces that all hit the same man at the same time, and one personal decision that cost him his place in the record books, but gave his family something worth a lot more. Now, before we go any further, I have to tell you something about the car, because if you've heard of Malcolm Durham at all, you probably heard about his Chevy too. And I need to address that right now because that story is wrong. Not completely made up, but wrong in a way that actually makes everything else make more sense once you understand it. And I'll get there. But first, let me show you exactly who this man was. Because you need to understand the peak before you can understand what went wrong. Who, H.E., was Malcolm Bernard Durham was born September 29, 1939, outside Goldsboro, North Carolina, Wayne County, tobacco country. A family farm with machinery that needed constant attention and a kid who paid attention to it. He said it himself years later. Driving those tractors was my first exposure to mechanical things. It created my interest in vehicles and such. That's a very quiet way to describe the beginning of something extraordinary. He moved to Washington, D.C. as a young man, attended a technical trade school for automotive work, landed a job as a mechanic at Hicks Chevrolet, 5929 Georgia Avenue, Upper Northwest, D.C. Remember that dealership because it becomes the center of everything. Through Hicks, he connected with Joe Pike, Chevrolet's national sales promotion manager, the man who was quietly running both the Corvette road racing program and a secret drag racing initiative behind GM's official motorsport ban. When Chevrolet released its first 427 cubic inch Z1 engines in 1963, Pike made sure Durham was among the first people in the DC area to get his hands on one. His first pass with that engine at 7580 Dragway in Maryland. 12.01 elapsed time. The year before, with his 409, his best was 12.26. The improvement sounds small. It was not small. That was a completely different category of car. He started winning immediately. Bill Jenkins, Dave Strickler, Hayden Proffitt, Don Nicholson. All of them ended up on the trailer against the car from the DC dealership. Track promoters started calling. Match race bookings started coming in. By early 1964, he was one of the most sought-after match racers on the East Coast. No factory money, no factory engineers. Just a mechanic from a DC Chevrolet dealership who understood cars better than people with unlimited budgets. And that's exactly where the first thing went wrong. To understand what Durham was up against, you have to understand what 1963 and 1964 actually looked like in drag racing. Ford had the Thunderbolt, factory built, factory engineered, factory money behind every single decision. Their drivers showed up with a team, with parts, with engineers who could diagnose a problem and fix it before the next round. Chrysler had the 426 Hemi. They had the Ram Chargers, which was literally a team of Chrysler engineers who raced on weekends and had access to the entire Chrysler Corporation behind them. They had dealership-backed teams everywhere. Sox and Martin were running as Chrysler's dominant factory experimental team, the best-funded operation on the East Coast, and then there was Chevrolet. In January 1963, GM issued a corporate ban on factory racing support. On paper, that sounds responsible. In practice, what it meant was that every Chevy loyalist was on their own. No factory money, no factory parts pipeline, no factory engineers. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because Vince Piggins over at Chevrolet figured out that you could order racing equipment through the central office production order system, and nobody in the corporate office technically had to know about it. That back channel becomes very important later in this story. But in 1963 and 1964, it wasn't fully developed yet. Durham was largely working with what he could get his hands on through Hicks and through Joe Pike's connections. So this is the environment. Ford has unlimited money, Chrysler has unlimited money and factory engineers, and Malcolm Durham has a dealership job and his own hands. Here is what he did with that situation. He looked at what Ford was doing with the Thunderbolt and he said, and these are basically his own words, "I can build a better car than that." So he bought a brand new 1964 Chevelle and dropped the Z1 427 into it. That part sounds straightforward. Here is what was not straightforward. He repositioned that engine 8 inches rearward from the stock location. Think about what that means mechanically. You are moving several hundred pounds of cast iron toward the center of the car. That changes how weight transfers when you launch off the line. Better rear traction. Better 60-foot times. The difference between spinning the tires and actually hooking up. That modification is worth tenths of a second in elapsed time. And at this level, tenths of a second is everything. And he did it in a way, his own words again, that few people could detect. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not a backyard operation. This was precision engineering work, done deliberately to hide a rules. Bending modification on a car that was technically supposed to be factory configuration. He was not cheating in a sloppy way. He was doing something sophisticated enough to fool trained eyes at the track, and the reason he had to do it this way is the whole point. The drivers with factory support did not have to hide anything. They had engineers who could argue with the rulebook. They had factory documentation to back up whatever configuration they showed up with. Durham had none of that. So he had to be creative, and he had to be invisible about it. This is what going wrong looks like when it is systemic. Not one dramatic moment, just a constant pressure. You have to be better than everyone else. And you have to do it in ways nobody can see. Because if they see it, you have no factory lawyer and no corporate backing to argue your case. Strip Blazer 2, with that hidden engine setback, became the car that beat Sox and Martin 5 consecutive times. Best factory-backed car on the East Coast, 5 times in a row. A man from a DC dealership with no factory money put them on the trailer 5 straight times. Think about that number. 5 in a row. Against Chrysler's top team. The system was rigged against him and he beat the system anyway. But beating the system did not change the system, and that matters for everything that comes after. Now we get to the Chevy 2. Starting in 1966, Durham built his first real tube chassis car. Not a modified production vehicle with an engine moved back 8 inches. A purpose-built drag car with a custom tube frame and a fiberglass body. The body was from a 1966 Corvair. He ran a nitromethane-burning Chevrolet big block V8 under that Corvair body. Obviously not the Corvair's air-cooled flat 6. The car competed in the early funny car class, which was just getting organized as an NHRA category at that point. He won the UDRA Nationals at US 30 Dragway with it. He was running in the 8-second zone with injection and nitro. In 1967, he added a supercharger and pushed that car to 7.98 seconds at 178 miles per hour. That is not a Chevy 2. So where did the Chevy 2 story come from? And why does it matter that it is wrong? Here is where the documentation failure happens, and this is the part of the story that I think tells you more about what went wrong with Malcolm Durham than almost anything else. The NHRA's own Top 50 profile, the official organizational record written at their 50th anniversary, incorrectly describes this car as a tube-frame Camaro. The Camaro did not exist until the 1967 model year. So calling a 1966 car a Camaro is already wrong before we even get to the Chevy 2 question. But the Corvair and the Chevy 2 Nova and the Camaro were all compact Chevrolets produced at roughly the same time. In low resolution, black and white photographs from track flyers and local newspaper coverage, they look superficially similar. And here is the critical thing. Match racing did not get the same careful documentation as national events. You have a blurry photograph in a program from Cecil County Raceway in 1966, and it says Durham, and it shows a small Chevy. And 40 years later, someone writes it up from memory and says Chevy 2, because that is the compact Chevy they remember from that era. Photographs from serious drag racing archives confirm the Corvair body. Forum posts on the Corvair Center Forum and vintage drag racing boards confirm the Corvair body. Period captions on original photographs confirm the Corvair body. The NHRA's own profile has an error. Secondary sources compounded the error. And the Chevy 2 got into the conversation and stayed there. Now I want you to think about why this happened specifically to Malcolm Durham and not to some of his contemporaries. Bill Jenkins had a factory-connected operation. He got profile pieces in Hot Rod magazine. He got features in Carcraft. When Jenkins showed up at a track, there was media there to document it carefully. The photographs were clear, the captions were accurate, the records were maintained. Durham was on the match race circuit, mostly hitting regional tracks in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, drawing crowds, winning money, beating nationally known competition, and almost never becoming the subject of a major national magazine feature the way his contemporaries did. And there is a reason for that too. Durham was direct about it in his later interviews. He said they encountered some problems in the South because those people did not want to accept them. That is a sentence doing an enormous amount of work through understatement. The racing press in the 1960s was not exactly rushing to put black drivers on their covers. The tracks where the cameras showed up most reliably were not always the tracks where Durham was racing. So what you end up with is a man who was winning constantly and being documented poorly. And when your documentation is a handful of track photos and the memories of promoters and fans, the record gets fuzzy. The wrong car gets attached to the right name. And 40 years later, the NHRA is publishing errors in their own official history. But here is the thing that Durham himself said about his visibility that I cannot get out of my head. He said for me being black was actually a plus because it made me unique, and I tried to capitalize on it as much as possible. In an era of open hostility, at tracks where some people genuinely did not want him there, he found a way to turn his visibility into an economic advantage. Track promoters booking cross-brand match races found that a black Chevrolet driver against white Mopar competition added another layer of crowd appeal, not always for good reasons. But Durham collected the appearance fees either way and spent the money on better equipment and put the results on the scoreboard. That is a remarkable thing to say, and a remarkable thing to actually execute across an entire decade of professional racing. ESPN called him drag racing's Jackie Robinson in their obituary. People who watched him race in the 1960s and 1970s wrote years later that because of his achievements, they knew as black racers they could reach the professional level in drag racing. That is the weight of what his presence in the sport meant. And the historical record could not even get his car right. That is the second thing that went wrong. Not a dramatic crash, not a failed engine program, just the slow, quiet failure of documentation. The kind of failure that happens to people who race without factory backing and national television coverage and magazine editors calling them for quotes. Before we get to the third thing, I need to show you exactly what was at stake. Because you need to understand the peak to understand the weight of what came after. After the Corvair funny car, Durham stepped up to what may have been his finest combination. He went to a log chassis. If you know funny car history from the late 1960s, you know exactly what that means. Logher was building the most sophisticated tube-frame flip-top funny car chassis available anywhere. The Logher brothers out of Michigan were doing work for all the top teams in the country. This was not a regional operation anymore. This was running with the best equipment the sport had. Strip Blazer 6, 1968, Camaro body over that log-her tube frame, mid-7-second elapsed times, broke 200 miles per hour in 1969. He also got hold of a Copo ZL1, all-aluminum 427 Camaro through Fred Gibb Chevrolet. That was Vince Piggins's back channel for getting racing equipment to Chevy loyalists without it showing up on GM's official books. The ZL1 engine is legendary. All aluminum 427 cubic inches. About 100 pounds lighter than the conventional cast iron 427. In a class where you are optimizing power to weight ratio, that 100 pounds is an enormous advantage. At his peak in the late 1960s, Durham was averaging $800 per match race appearance. Some weekends, multiple events. He had a hauler. He had a team. He had a reputation that stretched from Maryland to Florida on the East Coast. $800 in 1968. That is roughly $7,000 today. Per appearance. For a man who grew up on a farm in Wayne County, North Carolina, the competition he was running against during this period was the absolute top tier of the sport. Don Nicholson. Dick Harrell, who people called Mr. Chevrolet for very good reason. Jungle. Jim Lieberman, who was the greatest showman the sport probably ever produced. Sox and Martin, who Durham had already beaten repeatedly. The Ram Chargers with their factory engineering and unlimited resources. Durham held his own against all of them with self-built equipment and a team operating out of a shop outside Washington, D.C. In 1973, he built a Chevrolet Vega for pro stock competition. The ERTL diecast company produced a 1:8 scale model of that car. Model companies do not make replicas of drivers nobody cares about. That is the kind of commercial recognition that tells you exactly where the Durham name sat in the sport's cultural awareness at that moment. This is the man. This is the peak. Top 50 greatest drag racers who ever lived. One of the highest paid drivers in the country. Running times that put him in the same category as the national stars. Doing it without factory money and without factory engineers. Now here is the third thing that went wrong. 1971. Dick Harrell is killed in a funny car crash at Rockingham Dragway. Harrell was one of the best Chevrolet drag racers of his generation. Mr. Chevrolet, gone. Rockingham. The kind of death that sits in a racing community for years. He was not the only one. This period in funny car racing was genuinely dangerous in ways that are hard to fully appreciate today. The cars were getting faster, faster than the safety technology was keeping up. Fire suppression systems were inadequate. Driver restraints were inadequate. The accidents that were killing people were not freak occurrences. They were the predictable result of going faster than the infrastructure around you could handle. Durham hired team driver Lee Jones to handle funny car duties in the early 1970s as Durham himself shifted focus to pro stock. Lee Jones was part of the team, someone Durham knew, someone operating under the Strip Blazer name. 1975. Maryland International Raceway. Lee Jones suffers a fatal heart attack while driving and the car crashes. Durham's home track. Among people Durham knew, a driver who was part of his own operation. Gone. In that same year, 1975, Malcolm Durham made one of the most unusual decisions in the history of professional motorsports. He walked away, not because of injury, not because the money had run out, not because his equipment was no longer competitive, not because the match race circuit had dried up. He walked away to put his eldest son Bernard through college. The family needed him present. His son needed that investment. And Durham made the choice. 10 years, from 1975 to roughly 1984. 10 years where one of the 50 greatest drag racers who ever lived simply was not there, not building, not racing, not on the circuit. Gone from the sport at the absolute peak of his earning potential and his competitive ability. Now I want to be careful here about how I frame this. Because this is where the title of this video gets complicated. What went wrong with Malcolm Durham? When you look at this decision, you could argue this is the moment. This is the 10-year gap that broke the momentum. This is when the match race bookings stopped, when the team dissolved, when the equipment sat, when the reputation that had been built across 15 years of beating the best competition in the country stopped compounding and started fading. That is one way to look at it. Here is another way. This man had watched drivers die. He had watched his own team driver die on his home track. He had been operating in a sport that was taking lives with regularity. He had a son who needed college and a family that needed him present. And he made a decision that said, my family is worth more than my place in the record books. That is not what went wrong with Malcolm Durham. That is what went right with Malcolm Durham, the man. But it is absolutely what went wrong with Malcolm Durham, the historical figure. Because in motorsports, like in most competitive fields, the record books belong to the people who never stopped. The continuous careers get the documentation. The momentum builds on itself. The magazine profiles lead to more magazine profiles. The wins stack on top of wins, and the narrative stays alive. 10 years is not a hiatus. 10 years is a generation in drag racing terms. By the time Durham came back in 1984, the sport had completely transformed. The match race circuit he had dominated was different. The cars were different. The competition was different. The track promoters who had been calling him were running different kinds of shows. He competed at Maryland International Raceway's Mountain Motor Nationals in 1984. He crashed at Rockingham Dragway in 1985 and retired again. In 1989, he built a faithful recreation of the 1965 AFX Chevelle and raced it at Budds Creek against Don Nicholson and Arnie Beswick in a nostalgia event. This was before nostalgia drag racing became the organized phenomenon it is today. Durham was essentially doing it before it had a proper name, because he understood that what they had done in the mid-1960s was worth remembering, but the sustained career that might have kept his name in front of a new generation of fans, that was gone. Here is what survived. His wife Dartha was with him for 45 years through all of it. They raised 3 sons. Bernard drove. Reynard and Brian became professional engine builders. The sport did not just touch the Durham family, it absorbed them across generations. His shop near Washington, D.C. was still running in his later years, doing high-performance engine work for customer cars. People who were building Project Chevelles in the early 2000s mentioned bringing their cars to him and getting a tour of the shop. Old photographs on the walls, Durham telling stories about the cars. One person described spending an hour just talking about Chevelles. A hell of a racer and a hell of a nice guy is roughly how every single person who ever met him described him. Not in those exact words every time, but always some version of that. The racing ability and the character together. Never one without the other. The ERTL die-cast model of the 1973 Vega still exists. His first-place trophy from his very first race, that 1957 pass at Easy Street drag strip in Newton Grove, North Carolina, when he was 17 or 18 years old in a 225 horsepower 1956 Chevrolet. That trophy was still in the Durham family home in Lanham, Maryland when he died. That is where it started. A farm kid from Wayne County with a mechanical instinct developed on tractors. And that is where the physical record of it ended up. In a family home in Maryland. The NHRA Top 50. That is the number that outlasted everything else. That is the institutional record that survived the bad documentation and the 10-year gap and the Chevy 2 confusion. Somebody at the NHRA did the work of evaluating careers across the entire history of the sport and put Malcolm Durham in the top 50. That matters. It is not enough, but it matters. So, what went wrong with Malcolm Durham? The system went wrong first. He showed up to the factory wars with no factory behind him. Ford had unlimited money. Chrysler had unlimited money. Malcolm Durham had his hands and his brain and a job at a DC dealership, and he still beat them. He had to hide his best engineering work to stay competitive. because he had no corporate backing to argue the rules. He had to be better than everyone and invisible about it at the same time, and he was. But being better does not fix a rigged system. The record went wrong second. He raced at the tracks where the cameras weren't. He dominated a match race circuit that nobody was documenting carefully. He was black in a sport where the press was not rushing to write careful profiles of black drivers. And 40 years later, the NHRA could not even get his car right in their own official history. The Corvair became a Chevy too, and nobody who mattered caught it for decades. And then, the personal decision. He walked away at the peak, not from failure, from love. His son needed college. His family needed him. He had watched people die in these cars, including someone on his own team, on his own home track. He made the only choice a man with his values could make. And it cost him the sustained narrative that keeps a name alive across generations. Here is what did not go wrong. The man himself. He built better cars than people with unlimited budgets. He beat the best competition in the country on a regional shop budget for 15 straight years. He turned his visibility into an economic advantage when the system wanted it to be a liability. He raised 3 sons who all stayed in racing. He kept that first trophy from 1957 in his home for the rest of his life. Top 50 greatest drag racers who ever lived. That is the number. Everything else, the wrong car in the history books, the missing magazine features, the 10-year gap, all of that is what went wrong around him, not him, never him.